Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Robert R. Livingston, the Chancellor, one of the most important and underrated American revolutionaries. But before we explain his life and what I mean by the Chancellor, first we need to talk about that R in the middle, because at the time, in certain families, it was customary for a son to have his middle name be his father's first name. The problem is, Robert's father's name was also Robert Livingston, so the R either just stands for R, Robert R., or it stands for Robert, making his name Robert Livingston. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about his life. He comes from the Livingston family, which, as you may know, is one of the wealthiest families of the American Revolution. And Robert quickly becomes a lawyer, and by the age of 27, he's appointed as Recorder of New York, which was kind of a clerical position, but an important stepping stone for someone who wanted to make their way up in politics and law in New York City during the colonial era. Unfortunately for Robert, he's quickly fired from this position because he supports the American revolutionaries. That's okay though, because he is given appointment to the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress in fact. He runs over, starts talking to everyone there, and gets really pushy about independence. In fact, when the decision is made to write a Declaration of Independence, they appoint a committee of 5. Famously, Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, and it's fairly well known that Benjamin Franklin and John Adams also helped make some edits before it went to the whole Congress. But it's often overlooked that that committee of 5 had 5 people on it, and those other 2 people were Roger Sherman, who signed all the documents, and Robert R. Livingston, which means once the Declaration was completed, it first would have been shown to the whole committee for approval before it went to Congress. But Robert R. Livingston read a draft of the Declaration of Independence before anyone else other than really one other person, Roger Sherman. That being said, Robert R. Livingston is with New York. Now, on July 4th, New York doesn't vote for independence. I'm sorry, July 2nd, New York does not vote for independence. It abstains because they're waiting instructions from New York. But a few weeks later, a few days later, when instructions are updated, Robert R. Livingston does vote for independence. Unfortunately, you won't see his name on the Declaration because he immediately runs back home to New York to help create this new state. And once that state is created, Robert Livingston is named Chancellor of New York. Now, he would go by the Chancellor for the rest of his life. He would be Chancellor for 25 years. He just held on to the title for the rest of his life because that became kind of his nickname. Now, what is a chancellor exactly? Well, it's a little hard to explain. We know what a Supreme Court is. We're used to the Supreme Court of the United States. At the time, many states had separate court systems. So, Chancellor and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court were essentially equal positions, but they participated in different forms of law. One would look at, legal cases, business cases, law cases. The other would look at family matters and cases of that nature. So they just looked at different forms of the law, and this was looked at a way to separate power, so you didn't just have one court overseeing everything. In fact, side note, the Anti-Federalists, when the Constitution was being ratified, one of their arguments was, why is there only one Supreme Court? Shouldn't there be a Supreme Chancellorship? Anyway, Robert ran this show for, as I said, 25 years. During this time, he was also sent back to the Continental Congress, and from 1781 through the end of the Revolutionary War, he was actually Secretary of Foreign Affairs, corresponding directly, being in charge of communicating with the likes of John Adams, Jefferson didn't make it till after the war, but Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, becoming very associated with all of these people. Now, once the Constitution is ratified and George Washington becomes president, well, like all presidents, George Washington needs to take the oath of office. And, well, the first government took place in New York. So, as Chancellor of New York, Robert R. Livingston is the person who gave the oath of office to George Washington. And in fact, the Livingston Bible is still around. It is in the Freemason Grand Master Lodge of New York, which also is still around. And Robert had been Grand Master of the Freemasons, as many of the founders were. But his job is far from over. Robert R. Livingston then goes to Europe. He resigns as Chancellor in 1801. When newly appointed President Thomas Jefferson appoints Robert R. Livingston as minister to France. So he goes to France, where he meets with Napoleon. and Napoleon's people, mostly Napoleon's diplomats, but still, he's dealing with the Napoleon administration. And what's interesting is Robert Livingston is the first person that's approached by France regarding what we can now know as the Louisiana Territory. And the purchase of Louisiana is first offered to Livingston. Now, Livingston is joined by future President James Monroe within the next 2 years. It takes about 2 years to organize the Louisiana Purchase. And once that's underway, Jefferson sends help. And James Monroe shows up. And Monroe and Livingston negotiate the Louisiana Purchase and sign the treaty, which ends up purchasing Louisiana. So we have Robert R. Livingston very much to thank for doubling the size of the nation at that point, and essentially buying 1/3 of the modern continental United States. But Robert Livingston is far from done. You see, Robert Livingston, while he was in France, became friends with another American, actually, Robert Fulton, who had been dealing with steam. And at the time, steam power was kind of an up-and-coming thing. People were really excited about it. Whoever could figure out how to make a ship get powered by steam successfully and regularly could make a whole lot of money. Well, Robert Fulton had figured this out, and Robert R. Livingston had deep pockets to pay for it. So they come back to the United States after purchasing Louisiana, and they petition New York for a monopoly on steamboats, which they are granted. Now, Robert Livingston lives at a place called Claremont. It's right in the middle of the Hudson, right in between New York and Albany. And they have this new steamship, which they name after his house, the Claremont. And the Claremont is able to travel from New York to Albany in 1/2 the time that it was currently taking. At the time, it took about a week. Now they were doing it in about 3.5 days, which is an extraordinary improvement and a huge cut on time. And it just so happens, with his house, Claremont, being right in the middle, that became the main port of this ship. And this became the first successfully commercial ship in the world to be powered by steam. And the headquarters was his house in the middle. You would travel for a day and a half on the ship to his house, maybe take a break, maybe stay overnight, have some luxury goods, and then travel another day and a half or so to Albany. Because of this, Robert retires, makes a lot of money to add to his already deep pockets, and he ends up joining the Erie Canal Commission. And the Erie Canal was kind of people called it Clinton's Ditch after DeWitt Clinton, who was the governor of New York at the time. A lot of people thought this was a really stupid idea. You're telling me you're going to dig a hole from Albany to Buffalo? Cool, man. And they did. And it became one of the first superhighways in the world. One of the most fascinating, overlooked, and underappreciated engineering feats. I was saying in world history would be kind of a bold statement, but in American history, without a doubt. It's what connects New York City to the West. It's what makes New York City the New York City we have today, is that trade, which was not just because the canal that he helped build, but the steamships that he initiated and started cutting down on travel time so goods could be transported in such a timely manner. And just to recap, not only did he work with steam and improve and help create New York City, but this is a man who helped write the Declaration of Independence, kind of. The man who voted for independence, the man who ran the judicial system of New York for decades, the man who gave George Washington his oath of office, and the man who purchased the Louisiana Purchase, Robert R. Livingston. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, definitely hit like. I really appreciate it. And if you're new here, subscribe. I talk about a different American founder 7 days a week, and I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.